Mike Johnson, a man who built his entire political brand on constitutional expertise, thought he could lecture Jasmine Crockett about constitutional law on live television. What happened next left the House Speaker completely speechless and may have just delivered the most devastating political takedown of 2025. The most powerful Republican in the House of Representatives sitting in stunned silence as a first-term congresswoman systematically destroyed every legal argument he made. The cameras captured every second of his humiliation, and the internet is about to explode. The moment a seasoned lawyer from Texas exposed the Speaker's constitutional ignorance in front of millions of Americans is about to go down in political history. But before we dive into how Jasmine Crockett just ended Mike Johnson's credibility with one brilliant legal argument, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because what you're about to witness will be talked about for years to come. This wasn't just a political disagreement. This was a masterclass in how preparation, legal expertise, and fearless determination can completely dismantle even the most powerful opponents. Johnson walked into that hearing room thinking he'd easily handle any questions about his controversial emergency powers bill. Instead, he walked out looking like a law student who just failed his final exam in front of the entire class. And Johnson's face at the end was pure political devastation. The kind of moment that ends careers and creates legends. We're talking about a constitutional scholar being educated so thoroughly that even his Republican colleagues couldn't defend him. The fallout is still sending tremors throughout Washington, and you're about to see exactly why. Here's what you need to understand about this epic confrontation. On one side, you have Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, constitutional lawyer, Louisiana Republican, who's been involved in politics for decades. He's used to being the smartest guy in the room, the one who lectures others on the Constitution and legal precedent. Johnson had built his reputation as a constitutional scholar long before entering politics, working as an attorney for the Alliance Defending Freedom, where he argued religious freedom cases before federal courts. His rise to Speaker was no accident. Republicans chose him specifically because of his legal background and supposed constitutional expertise. He'd authored numerous legal briefs, taught constitutional law seminars, and consistently positioned himself as the party's leading authority on constitutional matters. Johnson's colleagues often deferred to his legal opinions, and he was accustomed to being the final word on constitutional interpretation within Republican circles. Johnson walked into this hearing with his usual confidence. He'd done his homework, had his talking points ready, and expected to easily dispatch whatever came his way. After all, he was the Speaker. He controlled the agenda, the timing, the entire workflow of the House of Representatives. More importantly, he truly believed his legal analysis was unassailable. His staff had prepared extensive briefing materials, and numerous constitutional law experts had reviewed his position, or so he thought. On the other side, you have Jasmine Crockett, a first-term congresswoman from Texas, former public defender, and civil rights attorney who'd spent her career fighting for justice in courtrooms across America. But to call her a newcomer would be a significant understatement. Crockett graduated from the University of Houston Law Center, where she served as an editor of the Houston Law Review. She then spent years as a public defender, handling some of the most complex constitutional cases in Texas federal courts. Her legal career was marked by victories in cases involving Fourth Amendment violations, due process rights, and equal protection challenges. She had argued before the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals multiple times and had never lost a constitutional law motion in federal court. While Johnson was giving political speeches about the Constitution, Crockett was actually litigating constitutional cases and winning them. But here's what Johnson didn't know. Crockett had been preparing for this moment for weeks. While he was focused on partisan politics and media appearances, she was deep in the constitutional law, studying precedents, and building a meticulously tight legal argument that would expose the fundamental flaws in Johnson's position. The stakes couldn't be higher. This wasn't just about a bill or a vote. This was about the future of constitutional interpretation, about whether political expediency could override legal precedent, and about whether a first-term congresswoman could stand up to the most powerful Republican in the House. The issue at hand was Johnson's controversial interpretation of emergency powers during the ongoing border crisis. He had pushed for a bill that many legal experts argued violated separation of powers principles. Critics called it unconstitutional, but Johnson had dismissed them as partisan attacks. What he didn't expect was for someone with Crockett's legal background to systematically tear apart his constitutional reasoning on live television. The stage was set for a showdown between political power and legal expertise, and only one of them was going to walk away with their credibility intact. The hearing began normally enough. Johnson, seated at the committee's head, opened with his standard remarks about border security and constitutional duties. His voice carried that familiar cadence of authority, the confidence of someone who'd never really been challenged on constitutional matters. The Constitution is clear about Congress's responsibility to secure our borders. This emergency powers bill is not just constitutional, but necessary for national security. The first few questions came from friendly Republicans who lobbed softballs that allowed Johnson to expand on his talking points. He quoted founding fathers, referenced historical precedents, and spoke with the certitude of someone who truly believed he had the law on his side. Then it was the Democrats' turn to ask questions. A few members asked pointed questions about executive overreach and separation of powers, but Johnson dispatched them with ease. He was clearly prepared for these standard objections. The gentle lady from California doesn't seem to understand the difference between emergency powers and executive overreach, Johnson said with a slight smirk, prompting chuckles from his Republican colleagues. He leaned back in his chair with the comfortable confidence of someone who'd handled thousands of similar challenges throughout his career. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tried to press him on the potential for abuse of emergency powers, but Johnson dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand. The gentlelady's concerns are unfounded. We have built-in safeguards and judicial review mechanisms that prevent any constitutional overreach, he replied, invoking the Supreme Court's decision in Dames and Moore v. Regan to support his position on executive emergency powers. The Democrats grew increasingly frustrated as Johnson seemed to have an answer for everything. He was clearly in his element, handling constitutional questions with the same ease as someone who'd been doing this for decades. Several Democratic staffers could be seen feverishly passing notes to their bosses, trying to find new angles of attack. But Johnson had anticipated every question. But then something shifted in the room. Jasmine Crockett had been sitting quietly taking notes, dissecting Johnson's answers with the intensity of a lawyer preparing for cross-examination. Unlike her Democratic colleagues who were asking broad policy questions, Crockett was dissecting the specific legal citations Johnson was using, checking them against her own research, and building what would soon become a devastating legal argument. The cameras captured the subtle changes in her body language, the way she sat up straighter when Johnson cited Youngstown Steel, the slight furrow of her brow when he mentioned Ex parte Milligan, the almost imperceptible shake of her head when he quoted from Korematsu. These weren't the reactions of someone who was intimidated or outmatched. These were the reactions of a seasoned attorney who had just realized her opponent had made fatal mistakes in his legal reasoning. When her turn came, the energy in the room shifted completely. Even the Republicans seemed to sense that something different was about to happen. "Mr. Chairman," Crockett began, her voice calm but carrying an edge that made everyone in the room sit up and take notice. "I've been listening to your constitutional arguments with great interest. As a former public defender who spent many years in federal court, I must say I'm perplexed by some of your legal reasoning." Johnson's smile faltered slightly. This wasn't the tone he usually heard from junior members. "If the gentlelady has specific constitutional law questions, I'd be happy to educate her," Johnson replied, trying to regain his authoritative tone. That's when Crockett's eyes lit up. The word educate was precisely what she had hoped to hear. "Oh, Mr. Chairman, I think there might be some confusion about who needs educating here," Crockett said. Her voice was still perfectly polite, but now carried an unmistakable challenge. The room fell silent. Even the Republicans stopped their side conversations to watch what was unfolding. This wasn't the usual partisan back and forth they usually saw. You see, Crockett continued, you've cited Youngstown Steel 3 times in your arguments today. But I don't think you've actually read the case, because if you had, you'd know that it actually undermines your entire position. Johnson tried to interrupt, but Crockett wasn't finished. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, and she wasn't going to let him deflect with political talking points. In fact, she said, pulling out a thick binder, I've prepared a detailed analysis of every single constitutional precedent you've cited today, and Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, you've gotten almost every single point wrong. The tension in the room was palpable. Republicans were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Democrats were leaning forward, sensing something big was about to happen. And Johnson's face began to show the first signs of genuine distress. Now, I could go through each case one by one, Crockett said, her voice growing stronger. But I think it would be more efficient to focus on the fundamental constitutional principle you seem to have forgotten. She stood up, gathered her papers, and walked to the podium. Every camera in the room followed her movement. This was no longer a routine hearing. This was about to become a defining political moment. Mr. Chairman, you've built your entire argument on the premise that emergency powers override constitutional limitations, but our system doesn't work that way. That's not how it has ever worked, and if you had actually studied the cases you've cited, you would know that. Johnson tried to interject again, but Crockett held up her hand. I'm not finished, Mr. Chairman. You wanted to educate me on constitutional law. Well, class is now in session. What happened next was nothing short of a legal masterpiece. Jasmine Crockett didn't just disagree with Mike Johnson's constitutional interpretation. She systematically destroyed it piece by piece, using the very cases he had cited against him with surgical precision. Let's start with Youngstown Steel, since you seem to love citing it so much, Crockett began, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who knew she was about to deliver a knockout blow. In Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company v. Sawyer, the Supreme Court unequivocally rejected the idea that emergency powers grant the executive branch unlimited authority. Justice Jackson's concurring opinion, which has become the bedrock of separation of powers analysis, actually supports the opposite of what you're arguing. She paused, letting that sink in before continuing. You've cited this case in support of executive emergency action. But, Mr. Chairman, this case actually rejected executive emergency action as unconstitutional. How do you reconcile that contradiction? Johnson tried to respond, stammering something about different interpretations and complex legal principles, but Crockett wasn't going to let him off the hook. Different interpretations? She said, raising an eyebrow. Mr. Chairman, this isn't a matter of interpretation. This is a matter of basic legal comprehension. The case says the exact opposite of what you're claiming. The room was silent except for the clicking of cameras and the frantic scribbling of reporters' pens. Everyone sensed something historic was happening, but Crockett was just getting started. She opened her binder and pulled out more material. Now, let's talk about Ex parte Milligan, another case you cited today. You used it to argue that wartime emergency powers justify suspending normal constitutional protections. But, Mr. Chairman, that case explicitly stated that the Constitution cannot be suspended even in wartime emergencies. She read directly from her notes. The Constitution of the United States is a law for rulers and people, equally in war and in peace. That's a direct quote from Milligan. Are you familiar with that part of the decision? Johnson's mouth opened and closed like a gasping fish. His usual confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by the creeping realization that he was being systematically exposed as constitutionally illiterate on live television. The context of that case, he began, but Crockett cut him off. The context, Mr. Chairman, is that you are citing cases you haven't read to support positions that they actually reject. That's not constitutional law, that's constitutional malpractice. The cameras zoomed in on Johnson's face, capturing every moment of his increasing humiliation. This was the Speaker of the House, supposedly one of the most powerful men in America, being lectured like a first-year law student who hadn't done his homework. But Crockett wasn't finished. She was building to a crescendo, and everyone in the room could feel it coming. Mr. Chairman, you went to law school. You've practiced law. You've taught constitutional law. How is it possible that you do not understand these basic constitutional principles? She paused for effect, her eyes locked on Johnson's increasingly panicked face. Unless you do understand them, and you are deliberately misrepresenting them to advance a political agenda that you know to be unconstitutional. The accusation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Crockett had just suggested on live television that the Speaker of the House was either incompetent or intentionally dishonest about constitutional law. There was no way out, no face-saving explanation. Johnson's face cycled through a range of emotions: shock, anger, despair, and finally acceptance. He knew he'd been caught. He knew that millions of Americans had just watched him be exposed as either ignorant or dishonest about the very Constitution he had sworn to uphold. "I think," Johnson finally managed to stammer, his voice barely a whisper, "we should move on to other questions." But Crockett wouldn't let him off that easily. "Oh no, Miss Chairman, you wanted to educate me on constitutional law. I think the American people deserve to hear your response to these contradictions. How do you explain citing cases that contradict your own arguments?" The silence stretched on, interminable. Johnson looked at his notes, at his staff, anywhere but at Crockett or the cameras. Finally, he mumbled something about consulting with counsel and abruptly called for a recess. But the damage was done. In less than 15 minutes, Jasmine Crockett had utterly destroyed Mike Johnson's constitutional law credibility, exposing his legal arguments as fundamentally flawed, and doing it all with such precision and authority that even his Republican colleagues couldn't defend him. As Johnson fled the hearing room, Crockett remained at the podium, calmly organizing her papers with the quiet satisfaction of a lawyer who just won the biggest case of her career. The expression on her face said it all. Mission accomplished. The immediate fallout from Jasmine Crockett's constitutional demolition of Mike Johnson was unlike anything political observers had seen in years. The hearing room devolved into a near uncontrollable scene as reporters scrambled to file hot takes and congressional staffers frantically called their bosses to report what they had just witnessed. Within minutes of the abrupt recess, social media exploded with clips, reactions, and instant analysis of what many were already calling the most devastating political takedown in recent memory. The speed of the story's spread was unprecedented, faster than any political moment since the January 6th hearings. Twitter's trending algorithms couldn't keep up with the volume of posts about the confrontation. The hashtag #CrockettSchoolsJohnson began trending within 30 minutes, quickly followed by Constitutional Masterclass and Speaker Meltdown. Videos of Johnson's face throughout Crockett's systematic dismantling of his arguments were shared thousands of times in just the first hour. TikTok users began creating split-screen videos showing Johnson's confident opening statements juxtaposed with his stunned silence at the end. Political Twitter went wild. But it wasn't just the usual partisan reactions. Constitutional law professors from across the country began weighing in, and their reviews were consistent. Crockett was absolutely correct, and Johnson's legal reasoning was fundamentally flawed. The academic legal community, rarely quick to opine on political moments, seemed compelled to validate Crockett's analysis. Harvard Law School professor Lawrence Tribe posted a detailed thread analyzing each of Crockett's legal points, concluding, "Congresswoman Crockett just delivered the most accurate constitutional analysis I've heard in Congress in years. Every single point was legally sound and brutally precise." His thread was retweeted over 50,000 times within 3 hours. Professor Neil Katyal, former acting Solicitor General, posted, "This is what happens when someone who actually understands constitutional law meets someone who just pretends to. Brutal and beautiful." Even conservative legal scholars, who typically championed Republican positions, couldn't defend Johnson's constitutional reasoning. But the reactions weren't limited to legal experts. Everyday Americans also shared the clips with awe and admiration for Crockett's performance. "I don't know much about constitutional law, but I know what getting schooled looks like," one viral tweet with over 100,000 likes read. Another user posted, Jasmine Crockett just showed us what real expertise looks like. This is why we need more lawyers and fewer politicians in Congress. Mainstream media outlets picked up the story immediately. CNN legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin called it one of the most impressive displays of constitutional knowledge I've ever seen from a member of Congress. MSNBC ran clips continuously throughout the evening, with constitutional scholars providing additional context that only made Johnson look worse. Even Fox News, usually sympathetic to Republican leadership, had to acknowledge what had happened. Their legal analyst, Andrew Napolitano, said on air, "Regardless of partisan politics, Representative Crockett was absolutely correct on the law. The Speaker's constitutional reasoning was indeed flawed." But perhaps the most telling reactions came from within Congress itself. Republicans who had been in that hearing room knew exactly what they had witnessed, and many privately expressed concerns about Johnson's leadership. One anonymous Republican aide told Politico, "We've always assumed the Speaker knows what he's talking about on constitutional matters. After today, we're not so sure about anything anymore." Meanwhile, Democrats openly celebrated Crockett's performance. House Minority Leader Haki Jeffs released a statement praising her brilliant legal analysis and fearless dedication to constitutional principles. Congresswoman Crockett demonstrated today why we need more legal experts and fewer political abusers in positions of power, Jeffrey said. Her mastery of constitutional law was evident to everyone watching. The implications of this confrontation went far beyond a single hearing or even Johnson's personal humiliation. Crockett had exposed a fundamental issue with how many politicians approach constitutional interpretation, treating it as a political tool rather than a serious legal discipline. Legal scholars began using the hearing as a teachable moment about the importance of actual constitutional knowledge versus political soundbites. Law schools across the country began incorporating clips into their constitutional law courses as examples of both sound legal reasoning and the dangers of constitutional ignorance. The political consequences were also significant and far-reaching. Johnson's credibility as a constitutional authority was permanently damaged, but the fallout extended beyond his personal humiliation. Within hours of the hearing, senior Republicans privately questioned Johnson's ability to lead on legal matters. Senator Ted Cruz, himself a constitutional lawyer, was reportedly shocked by Johnson's performance and concerned about the party's credibility on constitutional issues. The House Republican Conference held an emergency meeting the following day, where multiple sources reported heated discussions about Johnson's constitutional competency. Representative Chip Roy, known for his own constitutional advocacy, reportedly questioned whether Johnson should continue to lead on legal matters. The conference ultimately decided to curb Johnson's role in constitutional arguments and assigned a group of attorney members to vet all future legal positions. Meanwhile, Democrats seized the moment to elevate Crockett to leadership positions on constitutional matters. House Minority Leader Jeffs immediately appointed her to the House Judiciary Committee and announced she would lead a new Democratic task force on constitutional oversight. The Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee began featuring Crockett in fundraising materials, calling her the constitutional champion Democrats had been waiting for. But perhaps most importantly, this confrontation represented a generational shift in how constitutional law is discussed in Congress. Crockett, representing a new generation of legal minds in politics, showed that expertise and preparation can still triumph over political grandstanding and empty rhetoric. Law schools across the country began recruiting more diverse constitutional scholars, inspired by Crockett's example of bringing rigorous legal analysis to political debates. The broader message resonated with Americans who were tired of politicians talking about the Constitution without truly understanding it. Polling conducted by Morning Consult in the week following the hearing showed that 73% of Americans believed elected officials should be required to pass a basic constitutional knowledge test before taking office. More surprisingly, 68% of Republicans agreed with the proposal, indicating that even Johnson's party was concerned about constitutional competency in leadership. The American Bar Association issued an unprecedented statement calling for increased constitutional education for all elected officials, directly citing the Johnson-Crockett hearing as proof of the need for such training. The Federalist Society, despite its conservative leanings, lauded Crockett's strict adherence to constitutional text and precedent, while conspicuously avoiding any defense of Johnson's arguments. In the days after the hearing, Crockett's office was deluged with interview requests, speaking invitations, and messages of support from legal organizations across the country. The American Constitution Society invited her to deliver their annual lecture on constitutional law. Harvard Law School requested her participation in a symposium on separation of powers. Meanwhile, Johnson's office went into damage control mode, issuing statements about complex legal issues and different interpretive frameworks. But the explanations didn't stick. People had seen what happened on live television, and no amount of political spin could change the fundamental truth that he had been utterly outmaneuvered on constitutional law. The confrontation also sparked a broader conversation about the qualifications of political leaders. If the Speaker of the House, supposedly one of the most powerful men in America, could be so fundamentally wrong on basic constitutional principles, what did that say about the quality of leadership in Washington? Constitutional law professors began calling for basic competency tests for members of Congress on the very document they swore to uphold. While such tests would likely never be implemented, the conversation itself highlighted how Crockett's performance had exposed a real problem in American politics. The international reaction was no less impactful. Foreign media outlets covered the story as an example of American political dysfunction, but also as a sign of hope that some American politicians still took constitutional law seriously. The BBC ran a segment titled, "The Day American Constitutional Law Mattered Again," while German legal scholars lauded Crockett's impressive display of legal expertise in a political setting. As the weeks turned into months, the impact of that 15-minute exchange continued to grow. Crockett emerged as a national figure, frequently invited to explain constitutional issues on major news programs. Her legal analysis was consistently praised for its clarity and accuracy. Johnson, meanwhile, saw his influence wane. Republicans began looking to other members to lead on constitutional matters, and his ability to craft legal arguments for political purposes was severely damaged. The hearing became a case study in how preparation, expertise, and courage can still shift the political conversation. In an era often dominated by sound bites and political theater, Crockett's methodical destruction of Johnson's arguments showed that substance can still triumph over style. Young lawyers and law students across the country found inspiration in Crockett's performance. Applications to public interest law programs surged, with many students citing her example as a motivation to pursue careers in public service. The story wasn't just a political moment. It became a reminder of what American democracy could look like when there are people who actually understand the laws they've sworn to uphold. The confrontation between Jasmine Crockett and Mike Johnson will be remembered as a defining moment in modern American politics. The day a first-term Congresswoman's constitutional expertise utterly destroyed a speaker's political power on live television. Political historians have compared it to legendary congressional moments like Joseph Welch's "Have You No Sense of Decency?" confrontation with Joseph McCarthy, or Anita Hill's testimony that changed how America discussed workplace harassment. But beyond the immediate political implications, this moment also represented something more profound, a demonstration that knowledge, preparation, and courage can still matter in politics. In an era of political theater and empty rhetoric, Crockett showed that true expertise can still change the conversation. Law schools across America began incorporating the hearing into their constitutional law curricula as a perfect example of rigorous legal analysis in practice. The ripple effects extended into legal education itself. Applications to constitutional law programs surged by 40% in the months following the hearing, with many prospective students citing Crockett's performance as an inspiration. The University of Texas Law School, Crockett's alma mater, reported that inquiries about public interest law careers had doubled overnight. For Johnson, the hearing marked a permanent shift in his political standing. He could no longer claim constitutional authority without people remembering the day he was systematically exposed by someone who actually understood the law. Republican strategists privately conceded that Johnson's brand as a constitutional expert was irrecoverably damaged, forcing the party to seek new voices on legal matters. Several prominent conservative legal organizations quietly distanced themselves from Johnson's constitutional interpretations. The Heritage Foundation, which had previously featured Johnson in constitutional law seminars, removed his materials from their website. The Federalist Society, while not explicitly criticizing Johnson, began publicly showcasing other Republican lawyers in their constitutional programs. For Crockett, it catapulted her to national prominence as a serious legal mind and a fearless advocate for constitutional principles. She demonstrated that a newcomer with true expertise could stand up to the most powerful people in Washington and win. Book publishers began reaching out with offers for constitutional law texts, and major law firms started courting her for potential partnerships after her service in Congress. The hearing room where it all happened now stands empty but historically significant. The message was clear. In American democracy, the Constitution still matters. Expertise still counts. And sometimes the most powerful political moments come not from rhetoric or drama, but from someone who knows the law standing up and speaking the truth. What did you think of Crockett's constitutional masterclass? Do you believe politicians should be required to demonstrate actual knowledge of the Constitution they swear to uphold? The implications of this moment go beyond just one hearing. It gets to the very foundation of how our democracy operates and whether expertise still matters in politics. Drop your thoughts in the comments below about whether you think more lawyers like Crockett should run for office, or if you believe Johnson's embarrassment will force other politicians to actually study the Constitution before citing it. We want to hear your take on this historic moment, and don't forget to subscribe for more coverage of the moments when political courage meets constitutional knowledge. Turn on that notification bell because we're tracking every development in this story, from Johnson's attempts at damage control to Crockett's rising influence in constitutional debates. Because in times like these, we need more leaders like Jasmine Crockett who aren't afraid to speak truth to power, even when that power sits in the speaker's chair. Hit that subscribe button and share this video with anyone who believes that constitutional expertise should matter more than political posturing. The Constitution deserves defenders who actually understand it, and America deserves leaders who know the difference between legal arguments and political talking points. This is just the beginning of what could be a complete transformation in how constitutional law is discussed in Congress. With experts like Crockett leading the charge, we might finally see an end to politicians who treat the Constitution like a political prop instead of the supreme law of the land. Subscribe now so you don't miss a single moment of this constitutional revolution.